In the 3rd century BC, the streets of Rome were awash with rumors. Somewhere in distant Spain, near the Pillars of Hercules, a young man joined the crusade against the Roman Empire. There was talk of a great army, of battle elephants from India and Africa, of horsemen from Numidia, swordsmen from Iberia, and catapult men from the Balearic Islands. Rome remained calm. It ruled the seas, and the attacker had no ships. To reach the city by land, the invaders would have to conquer the Alps. No one had ever before dared to lead an army through the snow and ice across the mountains. Yet a young commander would be the first, and pit the ingenuity of his native Carthage against the might of Imperial Rome. Although he was as yet unknown to Rome, he would become the most feared and hated man of his time. And Rome would never forget his name, Hannibal. Hannibal was born in Carthage on the North African coast across from Sicily. Today, it is an affluent suburb of Tunis. Amongst the presidential palace and ministerial villas, archaeologists dig through 2,000 years of history, searching for the legendary Carthage. In 247 BC, this city by the sea wrestled for power with its nautical rival, Greece. Yet the year Hannibal was born, Carthage was at war with a new nation, a formidable military power that would one day cause its ultimate destruction, Rome. The first war between these two nations, the Punic War, ended 6 years after Hannibal was born. Carthage had been beaten, its fleet had been reduced to ruins, and the city itself was burdened with payments to the victorious Rome. The city had been destroyed so completely that modern archaeologists don't know exactly where to begin their digs. Yet the layout of what was once the world's wealthiest city is largely understood. While digging at a depth of 6 meters, they hit upon the foundation walls of the largest temple in ancient Carthage. Was it in this temple that the 9-year-old Hannibal swore to his father never to be Rome's friend? In 237 BC, the Greek scholar Polybius wrote how Hannibal's father, Hamilcar, set out with troops and his 9-year-old son to subjugate Iberia to the Carthaginians. The world was divided. The first war between Rome and Carthage was over. Carthage had been defeated. So Hamilcar left the city to make good its losses. His aim was to conquer the African lands to the west. As Hamilcar began his trek across North Africa, he set his sights on Spain, a country with which Carthage had been trading for centuries. Spain lay just across the Pillars of Hercules from North Africa. Carthage had already set up a colony there, from which it received its silver and bronze. The entire peninsula beckoned to the conqueror. And once Spain was taken, what next? Perhaps Rome itself could be entered by the back door. Following the land route on the North African coast, Hamilcar crossed at Gibraltar. 10 years later, Spain was under Carthaginian rule, all the way to the River Ebro. Rome secured a treaty limiting the Carthaginian advance, this far and no further. But Rome now had an enemy at its door, and an uneasy peace. At this time, Rome was still a small city. The marshes between the hills had not yet been drained, the roads hadn't been paved, and fires were a constant danger. Buildings which we now associate with ancient Rome, such as the Colosseum and the Pantheon, weren't built until centuries after the war against Hannibal. But the small city was home to military greatness. It had already conquered large parts of what today is Italy, defeated Carthage in the First Punic War, with Sicily and Sardinia as spoils. Yet Rome still wasn't satisfied. Despite its defeat, Carthage was still the richest city in the ancient world. Everything that can be bought with money reached its markets. Ceramics from Greece, perfumes and spices from the Orient, gold from Africa, silver and bronze from Spain, ivory, lion and leopard skin, and even entire villas were imported. This commerce was the foundation of immeasurable wealth for just a few families, and gave them great political influence. Particularly influential amongst them was the Barcas family. Hamilcar Barcas was the owner of a large firm and at the same time the highest ranking commander in Carthage. His 3 sons were called the Lion's Brood. Fighting, riding and archery made up their everyday activities, and no one was their equal in fierceness or courage. The oldest, Hannibal, was taught philosophy and foreign languages by a Greek tutor, and battle techniques by his father. By 221 BC, Hamilcar had been killed and his successor assassinated. A new general emerged to lead the war against Rome. In his 26th year, Hannibal was chosen as the new commander. True to his oath never to be Rome's friend, he conquered the city of Saguntum, which was allied with Rome. He crossed the border river, the Ebro, into the Roman sphere of influence. Rome declared war, and the Second Punic War had begun. With 70,000 warriors, 15,000 horses, and 37 battle elephants, he headed over the Pyrenees towards the east. Marching along the coast, Hannibal encountered the river Rhone in France. On the opposite bank lurked a Celt army. They knew crossing the river in small boats would be difficult for the invader, and they expected and hoped for a quick and decisive victory. During the night, Hannibal sent a cavalry unit across the river. When the battle began, the cavalry attacked the Celts from behind. In fear of their lives, the Celts fled in disarray. To get his army across the Rhone, Hannibal commandeered boats from local fishermen and had them build rafts for the elephants. The Greek scholar Polybius recorded the event. But a few plunged into the river out of fear in the middle of the crossing. Their riders all lost their lives, while the elephants were saved. For because of their strength and the length of their trunks, which they held above the water so that they could breathe, they were able to withstand, even though they had to walk the greatest distance, standing straight up under the water. At the same time, a Roman army was positioned in Marseille and was preparing for an attack on Carthaginian Spain. The news arrived that Hannibal had crossed the Rhone, so the Roman consul decided instead to pursue Hannibal. The Roman army searched in vain for him and returned to Marseille, only to set out again with orders to stop Hannibal before the great warrior could reach Rome. It was now clear in Rome that Hannibal was considering the unthinkable, to cross the Alps and attack Rome from the north. Time was running out. 10 days had passed since the battle at the Rhone. The powerful army continued to march eastward to the snow-covered peaks of the Alps. In the narrow ravines of the foothills, predatory mountain tribes were already waiting in ambush. Horses and beasts of burden and weapons, equipment, food supplies, all these spoils seemed to be almost within their grasp. But it was not to be. Despite heavy losses, Hannibal managed to occupy the high grounds, and the tide of attack turned against the tribesmen. Most of them were killed. On the same day, he raided their village, taking grain and animals for food, and enough supplies for his troops to last for 3 days. Behind him, he left the earth scorched. There are some scholars, however, who are skeptical of the whole idea of an army traveling across the mountains on the backs of elephants.
The classical civilizations really didn't need reporters. The men in power did that themselves. The consuls prepared reports, but even adversaries had somebody at their side. The difficulty did not really arise until now. How can we ever make a war clear? Then the next question, how can a Roman legionnaire be made clear? One who goes around with a shield and sword and the like. We do not even know how the cavalry battles of World War I were conducted. And an elephant march over the Alps? I don't know how they could imagine that.
I can well imagine that battle elephants were used in the same way that we work with circus elephants. It's true that an elephant, if well trained, does exactly what he's told to do. Whether he is to strike someone with his trunk, or step on someone with his foot, or run through an obstacle, or attack someone on command, the animal can be taught to do this. And how they were equipped with mahouts, that they had saddles and various leather coverings. But of course, that was only possible with a lot of love and understanding. But I'm certain that any elephant can learn that.
In the 1950s, the English scientist John Hoyt tried for the first time to practically demonstrate which route Hannibal could have taken over the Alps. He set off into the mountains with an elephant, heading for Italy.
Well, we're out to try and discover which way Hannibal used when he crossed the Alps 2,000 years ago. Now, there are a number of different theories. We believe that he crossed by the Col de Clapier. Well, we know that Hannibal took both Indian and African ones. Ours is Indian, mainly because they're far easier to control anyway.
But Hoyt had the luxury of using a modern asphalt road on nearby Mount Cenis for his historical reconstruction, instead of the snowy Clapier Pass. Hannibal's Alpine expedition has passed into history. It has fueled the writings of Roman satirists and of William Shakespeare. Yet nobody today knows the route Hannibal took. The route he followed from the Rhone all the way to Turin more than 2,000 years ago. At which tributary did he turn east? Was it the Drôme or the Isère? Which pass did he choose to cross over into Italy? Mount Genèvre, Mount Cenis, the Clapier Pass, or even the small Saint Bernard? Even after thousands of years, there is no definitive answer. Polybius and Livius, who both recorded the crossing, appear to contradict each other. Francis de Koninck, a passionate Hannibal researcher, believes he has solved the riddle.
Quand on fait de l'histoire, il faut absolument retrouver.
When one deals with history, it is essential to go back to the sources and to study all the places of Hannibal's Alpine passage in the text.
On fait la séparation entre le texte de Polybe et le texte.
However, this is not possible if one is studying the text from Livius and Polybius.
On décrit deux routes différentes.
They each describe two different routes. One leads over the small St. Bernard, the other over Mount Genèvre. It is therefore impossible to make a single route out of these two, which would correspond with Hannibal's route. Here on the left, this is the small St. Bernard, which separates France from Italy.
The day would come when Rome would not blindly put its trust in its mountains. In modern times, it trains men to fight in these areas. But in the 3rd century BC, the passes into the mountains were unguarded. Almost half a year had elapsed since Hannibal left Carthage. He secured his supply lines by stationing units in the Pyrenees and in the south of France. He now set out with 50,000 men across the Alps. He encountered cold, hunger, ambushes. Only half of his army survived the hardships, and he was still far from his goal. On level and open terrain, the elephants can cover 20 kilometers a day, but they managed only a fraction of that distance. The stony surfaces were too hard for their soft feet. According to Polybius, Hannibal still had more than 200 kilometers to cross and needed 15 full days in order to accomplish it. Then came something very unfamiliar to the soldiers, horses, and elephants alike: snow. Polybius wrote, "Already exhausted by the many hardships which they continuously were forced to endure, another snowfall caused great alarm. Everything was covered with snow when they began marching at daybreak, moving very slowly, listlessness and despair showing on all the faces." Many years after John Hoyt's journey across the Alps, two mountain guides set off themselves to follow Hannibal's tracks. They ended up confirming Hoyt's theory.
Donc là, on est bien maintenant arrivé au col Clapier. On a donc bien suivi.
We followed Hannibal's route and are now standing in the Clapier Pass.
La haute vallée de Savigne, qui conduit comme ça.
The Savine Valley here leads to the top of the pass, that is, to the border with Italy.
Qui est la chute, là, le col Clapier, vers l'Italie.
I think Hannibal's passage was in the autumn. The snow must therefore have been still so fresh that the elephants sank into it, finding solid ground underneath which they could walk on. That would have been impossible in the frozen snow of the spring.
In addition, at that time there was already a Roman road here, which was in very good condition. Hannibal must certainly have had excellent mountain guides.
Despite losing many men and animals on the journey, at the top of the Clapier Pass, Hannibal showed his officers Italy. Rome was as good as conquered. Hannibal would soon be the ruler of the great empire. The news of Hannibal's successful crossing of the Alps alarmed Rome. A second consul quickly set out from southern Italy to the north. While the legions faced one another on the battlefields, the day-to-day life of Rome went unchanged. The war was left in the care of the soldiers. The inhabitants of Rome still didn't feel threatened by this small army under the leadership of a young man. Even the image of the enemy offered refuge. Carthaginians were regarded as stupid barbarians, dog-eaters, and child murderers. Like the Romans, the Carthaginian Greeks worked as architects. The physical work was done by slaves. The slaves in Carthage were put to work in caves and caverns. They had to pound stones out of rock, which were needed for construction in Carthage. They were never to leave these caves again. Only as corpses would they be brought back to the surface. Carthaginian rituals were considered barbaric by the Romans. It was said that in times of need, the Carthaginians would sacrifice their own children in order to receive mercy from the gods. An ancient report describes the gruesome ritual. It is night, undoubtedly a full moon. The scene is lit by the flames of a funeral pyre kindled on the site of a grave. Next to the fire is a bronze statue of Baal Hamon, his arms extended, palms tilted, so that a child laid on them rolls off and falls into the flames. gods only willingly accepted children as sacrifice from the upper class, so many aristocratic families bought slave children for the sole purpose of sacrificing them in place of their own children. The year 218 BC. Hannibal had reached the river Trebia near Piacenza. Roman legions stood on the opposite bank of the river. Both armies prepared themselves for battle. The battle elephants are painted in bright colors. To make them weapons of war, Hannibal shielded their hides with armor. A tower for archers was strapped to their backs. Their tusks were armed with sabers, and sometimes a type of sickle was fastened to their trunks. Transformed in this way, they then received rice wine to drink, stimulating their urge to attack. Naturally, elephants instigated in this manner would pose a danger to their own ranks. In the event that it would trample down a friend instead of a foe, the Indian rider, or mahout, sitting on the animal's neck, would have a hammer and chisel ready in order to split the animal's skull. In the morning haze of December the 21st, the battle began. The Roman legions plunged through the ice-cold water of the Trebia and stormed the opposite riverbank. Hannibal had been expecting such a move, and during the night he had prepared an ambush. The fighting was short and very bloody. The Romans were surrounded and defeated. 8,000 of them lost their lives. The Carthaginians suffered only limited losses. But only one of the 37 battle elephants survived the slaughter. No one knows whether they were killed by the enemy, whether the frigid cold killed them, or whether their riders had cause to use the hammer and chisel. Surus, the last of the elephants, carried Hannibal nearer to Rome. March 217 BC. The route to Rome was blocked by newly appointed legions, so Hannibal made for the difficult route over the Apennine Mountains and straight through the marshes of the Arno. He had been weakened by the fighting and was sick, suffering from an eye infection. After 4 days and 3 nights of riding through the insect-infested marsh area, he went blind in one eye. June 217 BC. Hannibal continued his crusade relentlessly, and at the Battle of Lake Trasimeno, he proved himself a shrewd tactician once again. At night, he hid half of his troops in the hills on the northern shore of the lake. Through the early morning fog of the following day, the unsuspecting Roman cohorts marched right into the ambush. The Carthaginians attacked from all sides and drove the Romans to the lake. Today in Turo, street signs and plaques are reminders of the battle between Hannibal and the Roman commander Flavius. In Turo, the 2,000-year-old story about the war with Hannibal is very much alive, more so than anywhere else in Italy. In their storytelling, there's no difference between a young and an old story. UN deployments of Italian soldiers have the same significance as the battle of Roman legions against Hannibal. In the battle, 10,000 prisoners were taken, and 15,000 soldiers lost their lives. In Italian, the word for blood is sangue, and the name Sanguineto means place of blood.
There,
where the mountains fall off to the lake, the Romans came, drawn by the fires. They had lined themselves up in order to attack head-on, but the Carthaginians had hidden themselves around them in the mountains. As soon as the Romans were in the trap, the Carthaginians stormed upon them. It was a bloodbath.
Sanguinito gets its name from the battle against Hannibal. The Macerone River, today called Sanguinito, is said to have been red for 3 days from the blood of the slain Romans. That's what's in the history books at any rate.
Polybius wrote about the defeat of the Roman army. Most of them fled into the water until only their heads jutted out of the water. As the cavalry then appeared, and they could see their own destruction standing before them, they begged loudly for deliverance, and finally met their death through the enemy. Lake Trasimeno lies barely 150 kilometers from Rome. News of the catastrophic defeat reached the city the next day. People flocked to the forum, and rumors abounded. Flavius had been killed in the battle. Were there any prisoners? How could Great Rome have been defeated by the barbarians? Rome feverishly prepared itself for Hannibal's attack. The walls were reinforced. The bridges over the Tiber were demolished. The entire city was engulfed in fear and pandemonium as it waited for the coming of Hannibal. As the Romans prepared themselves for battle, all the weapons and armor that could be found were put to use. In the back lot of an Italian film company are replica swords and armor used by the Romans. The arms master at Cinecittà explains.
This here is a short sword, like the Roman soldiers carried by their sides. It was the last weapon for self-defense, if the spear had already been lost.
Corazza per ufficiale romano.
And this here is the armor of a Roman officer. The shoulder piece. The helmet ready for battle.
Pronto per il combattimento.
Despite Rome's fears, Hannibal headed past Rome towards southern Italy and occupied the small settlement of Cannae. Too weak to attack Rome, he resupplied his army by ravaging the Italian countryside. Yet Hannibal was no closer to his political goal. Despite his overwhelming victory at Lake Trasimeno, most of Rome's allies hesitated to support him. A year later, 2 new consuls had been elected in Rome. The Senate decided to pull all its forces together to defeat the Carthaginians and drive them out of Italy. In August 216 BC, the largest army that Rome had ever put together headed for Cannae. 80,000 Roman legionnaires pitted against the 50,000 of Hannibal. On August the 2nd, a hot wind from the south caused a great sandstorm, and the sun blinded the Romans. The Carthaginians stood to the south, the Romans to the north. Despite being outnumbered almost 2 to 1, Hannibal set up a bold trap. Hannibal had far more horses than the Romans, so when his cavalry charged, they cut the Roman cavalry to pieces. The Romans then tried to counterattack, so Hannibal had his infantry fall back. The Romans had fallen into the trap. Hannibal's cavalry from the left wing joined those from the right, and together they closed in behind the Romans, forming a circle. The circle, now complete, became a ring of death. 70,000 Roman soldiers were butchered. The historian Livius described the fate of the wounded on the following morning. Some tried, covered with blood, to stand up in the middle of this field of corpses. Since the morning cold caused their wounds to contract, they roused from unconsciousness and were beaten back down by the enemy. A few, whose thighs and knee joints had been cut through, were found to be still living. They uncovered their necks and demanded that the remainder of their blood be shed. Was this the end of Rome? Hannibal's brilliant circling tactic, today called the Carne, has been attempted throughout history. In World War I, according to General Schlieffen's plans, the Germans tried to turn all of northern France into a giant Carne. They failed. In World War II, Adolf Hitler claimed, "In the history of the world there have been only 3 battles of annihilation: Carne, Sedan, and Tannenberg." And as recently as the Gulf War, General Norman Schwarzkopf deployed his tanks as Hannibal deployed his cavalry. But on this occasion, Schwarzkopf chose to stop before closing the ring. What would Hannibal have thought of today's battlefields, where the enemy is rarely seen, and instead of swords, poisonous gases and electronically guided missiles are the weapons of war? After Hannibal's triumph in Carne, every house in Rome was in mourning. Assuming Rome had lost the will to fight, Hannibal waited for an offer of peace. But Rome was not considering surrender. It doubled taxes to rearm itself. To replenish the legions, it resorted to drafting prisoners and slaves into the army. The war went on for another 13 years. As the fighting continued, Hannibal needed reinforcements from his brother Hasdrubal. He was supposed to be bringing him a new army and elephants from Spain. But Hasdrubal had been beaten and beheaded. Much earlier in the war, Hannibal's other brother, Mago, had already sailed home to Carthage to organize supplies. Unlike Hasdrubal, he did not let Hannibal down. Landing in Carthage, Mago brought the Council of Elders the spoils of war: 2 baskets of gold rings taken from fallen Roman officers. Yet Carthage did nothing. Rome, meanwhile, continued to arm itself, almost to the brink of bankruptcy. It doubled all taxes, decreased the amount of silver in its coins, and even delayed paying the very legionnaires who were protecting Rome from Hannibal. The Roman army was growing ever larger and recapturing cities that Hannibal had claimed as his. In 213 BC, the port city of Syracuse in Sicily, one of Hannibal's few allies, was besieged by Roman ships. For 2 years, the mighty walls held the Romans at bay, thanks not least to the genius of the scientist Archimedes, who kept discovering new defensive weapons for his city. A gigantic crane lifted entire ships out of the water and smashed them into pieces. In the end, a surprise attack caught Syracuse off guard. After a siege lasting nearly 2 years, the city was plundered and Archimedes was killed. Still, Carthage did nothing. The impression was that they only wanted to keep Rome small, not destroy it. Trade relations were never broken off between the two cities. While the troops were in battle, the businessmen conducted trade. This is illustrated by finds of Roman commodities in Carthage during the time of the Punic Wars.
Here you have some fragments of tableware which was made near Naples. And this production begins in the time of the Hannibal War. It may have got here during the time of the blockade, but not all of it.
The Roman general Scipio finally persuaded the Senate that Hannibal could only be beaten if Carthage was beaten. In 202 BC, Scipio invaded North Africa. The Carthaginians turned to their gods for help. They also turned to Hannibal, who they had steadfastly ignored during his invasion of Italy. The two commanders met south of Tunis. Hannibal offered peace, but Scipio, just 100 miles from Carthage, could taste victory and decided to fight. Once again, Hannibal used elephants in battle, 80 in total, and at the Battle of Zama, they charged the Romans. But Hannibal's opponent had learned a lot from him. Scipio countered with a blast of trumpets. Frightened by the noise, the animals stampeded, crushing their own men. With the defeat of Hannibal, the Second Punic War came to an end. Years later, Rome demanded that its archenemy be delivered into its hands. Hannibal fled. For 13 years, Rome's spies tracked him across North Africa. Offering his genius and his sword, Hannibal served the kings of Tyria and Bithynia in battle against the Roman Empire. The Greek philosopher and historian Plutarch wrote of Hannibal, saying, "He was pursued like a bird which is too old to fly away because he has lost all his tail feathers." In the year 183 BC, Hannibal was betrayed and Roman legionnaires surrounded his house. This time, the old general couldn't escape. He drank a cup of poison. Plutarch recorded his last words. "It is now time to end the Romans' fear. They can no longer wait for the death of an old man who brought them so much sorrow." Even in death, Hannibal escaped the Romans. His grave lies in foreign parts on a hill above the sea. But the Romans' fear of Carthage did not end with his suicide. 40 years later, they besieged his hometown, conquered and destroyed it. They scattered salt on the soil. Their priests cursed the place for 100 years. But for centuries to come, whenever Rome was in danger, the cry would go up, "Hannibal is at the gates."